Hello and welcome to Byju's IAS. Let's begin today's session of comprehensive news analysis with the first article from the Hindu newspaper that talks about the plight of the women in Afghanistan and how the Taliban taking over the country has changed their life all of a sudden. The author here tells us that ever since Taliban has taken over Afghanistan, the situation of women in the country has gone from bad to worse. Although to present a positive image in front of the world, the Taliban leadership did make a lot of promises, including allowing women to have their own way of life, allowing them to get educated, and allowing them to marry the partner of their choice. However, the reality has been extremely different. There have been multiple reports suggesting that a lot of regressive steps have been taken to reduce the participation of women overall in the society in all spheres. Not only women have been mandated to wear clothes that completely cover their hair, body, and most of the face, they have also been stipulated that whenever they leave their home, they can't be alone. There always has to be a male member with them, accompanying them whenever they step outside. As I said earlier, the Taliban, in front of the entire world, repeatedly assured that women will get access to education and employment. However, this has not been translated on the ground. Many women are now without any jobs. They have been asked to stay away from work. Before the Taliban took over the country, women made up 27% of the workforce in the government offices, and now there are almost none that are found there. All these new vacancies created by forcing the women to stay at home have to be filled by male officials who are now making all the decisions, including the decisions that involve women and their life. The education sector specifically has been the hardest hit with respect to women and their rights. The Taliban's Ministry of Education ordered the male students and the teachers from classes 6 to 12 to return back to their schools, but the school girls were not told to return back to their schools. In other words, the girls have only been allowed to be educated in the primary school without any participation in the secondary school. Just last year, before the Taliban took over, the girls made up 39% of the country's 95 lakh college students. But now, this all has changed. Although the Taliban did make a statement saying that adult women's consent will be necessary at the time of the marriage, this statement also has not translated into the truth. Why? Because number one, there is no definition of what exactly would be an adult woman in the country. Secondly, just talking about and giving them the right to marry their own, just talking about and giving the women the right to marry the partner of their choice does not equate to women empowerment. The Taliban has not made any mention of ensuring jobs or education for women. Although the Taliban has tried hard to present a liberal image in front of the world, to prove to the world that they are not the same Taliban that ruled over Afghanistan earlier, but on the ground, the situation seems to be very similar to what was happening earlier. As per a UNICEF report, 28% of Afghan women aged between 15 and 49 years were married before they reached the age of 18. Almost 87% of Afghan women have had to face violence of at least one kind. Ever since Taliban has taken over the power, they have released a lot of detainees from the prison, including many of those who were in jail for gender based violence. Now, just imagine a husband who was in the jail for beating up his or her wife because his wife had complained to the police. When this husband goes back from the prison to the home, would that wife now be safe or not? Would that marriage be safe or not? This is the predicament that the women are facing right now in Afghanistan. The Taliban replaced the Women's Affairs Ministry in the Afghanistan government with the Ministry for Promotion and Propagation of Virtue and Prevention of Vice. Not just this, an extremely important law that criminalized rape and forced marriage has also been taken out by the Taliban. Thus, these offenses are bound to rise in the country at a rapid pace now. Now, you would have seen this argument time and time again that this Taliban regime is trying extremely hard to distinguish itself from the old Taliban regime, which did not really care about the world. Ever since this Taliban government has taken over, they have tried to forge foreign relations with many countries, including India. Many of their leaders have given statements that they would like to maintain friendly relations with India. There can be multiple reasons why the Taliban leaders are trying to project a changed image. Number one, the experts say that since their negotiations were taking place in Qatar in a very luxurious environment in a seven-star hotel, maybe now the leaders of Taliban have gotten used to these worldly luxuries and they want to be a part of the global exchanges where they are offered such courtesies from other nations. The second opinion is that maybe the Taliban leaders understand that in order for them to set up a successful government in the long run, to ensure that after a decade or so the Western powers don't come and attack them again, they should maintain friendly relations with the outside world. However, despite this facade of trying to project themselves as a new Taliban, the situation has remained the same in the country as we just discussed. In the 1990s, in the time of the old Taliban, they were not really interested, as I said, about forming international relations with any other country. The only countries that recognized Taliban at that point of time were Pakistan, Saudi Arabia, and the UAE, with other countries, including India, not even recognizing the Taliban regime. However, this time the Taliban seems to want better relationship with other countries in the West, neighboring Pakistan, Iran, China, Uzbekistan, etc. In fact, they have urged many countries not to close their embassies in the country and those who have closed them up to reopen them again. We have seen multiple times in the past 1 month or so that positive statements have been made by the Taliban leaders about America as well, which they used to call their biggest enemy. When the Taliban took over the country, their leader gave their first interview to a women journalist to highlight to the world how we have changed. However, the entire cabinet formed by the Taliban comprised of all male. All the important positions in the government are given to the males, and even the most minute decisions about the females will be taken by the male members of the cabinet. Not just this, the government jobs also are being kept out of the purview of the females, as we just saw, with most of the secondary schools and colleges closing their door for the girl child. Thus, there seems to be a lot of difference between what the Taliban is projecting and what is happening on the ground. The next article that we have talks about India's efforts to reconcile with the Central Asian nations and how India should make as many attempts as possible to come close to the Central Asian nations. In the recently held India Central Asia Dialogue, which was the third installment of this, our external minister, that is Sri S. Jaishankar, represented India and engaged with the foreign ministers of the five Central Asian nations. They talked about giving immediate humanitarian aid to Afghanistan, increasing trade amongst themselves, and improving their connectivity. Now, the fact is that India has neglected the Central Asian region for a long time with no big minister or the prime minister visiting these nations. However, that has changed in the past few years. In fact, just in the past few months, our foreign minister has visited this region multiple times. Not just this, as we know, all the leaders of the five Central Asian nations have been invited to be the guests at a Republic Day parade. The joint statement that was issued after this dialogue talks about the broad regional consensus on Afghanistan and how to improve the situation in the region. Now, India can take a leaf out of the book of these nations. As we know, Central Asian nations such as Uzbekistan and Turkmenistan have reopened their diplomatic missions in Taliban since they are their neighbors and they share a lot of tribal connection with Afghanistan. Apart from discussing the situation in Afghanistan, the dialogue also talked about the bilateral relation between this region and India. Trade between India and Central Asia has remained extremely low, below $2 billion. Although in the past few years, India has extended a credit line of about $1 billion for multiple projects in Central Asia, including the connectivity initiatives such as the Chabahar port and the International North South Transport Corridor and the Tapi pipeline, which will initiate in Turkmenistan, travel through Afghanistan, Pakistan, and reach India. This is a project that has long been pending because of involvement of Pakistan and its lack of interest in including India in this particular project. The article says that maybe one of the reasons that India and Central Asian nations have not been able to come close to each other is because of the involvement of China. These countries were a part of the Soviet Union, and even after the Soviet Union broke off, Russia still has a great influence in this region. The Chinese Belt and Road Initiative, which includes these nations, involves increased trade for this region and increased infrastructure investment, which has helped these nations come close to China. Meanwhile, the problem that India is facing is that we don't have a direct connectivity to Central Asia. We need to go through Pakistan, which obviously is a major problem for India. And the second option that we can have is to go through Iran's Chabahar port. But the problem is, ever since Taliban has taken over Afghanistan, we are not sure if they would allow us to have a route from Chabahar to Afghanistan and to the Central Asian region. Also, the work on the Chabahar port has been delayed due to various reasons, including India not giving the promised installments on time and the fear of American sanctions on this project. Now, there is a reason why Prime Minister Modi has been focusing on the Central Asian nations ever since he has come to power. There is a lot of potential of improving relationship between the two regions, as well as there is a historical connection between the two. Let's see what that is. Now, the ancient kingdoms of Kushana Empire had their territory in both the regions. Not just this, the Mughal ruler Babur was born in Uzbekistan and spent his childhood in the country before moving towards India. Both the regions have also been connected through the Silk Route from the 3rd century BC till 15th century AD. Buddhism also traveled through this route only from India to Central Asia and to reach the western part of China. All the Central Asian nations are extremely energy rich but still remain extremely poor since these nations are landlocked and don't have enough connectivity to export their energy sources. Kazakhstan is a leading producer of uranium and has enormous oil and gas reserves. Uzbekistan is also extremely rich in gas and is a significant producer of gold along with Kyrgyzstan. Tajikistan also is known to have extremely high hydropower potential, with Turkmenistan having the fourth largest gas reserves in the entire world. Their location also makes them extremely strategic, with these countries acting as a bridge between the regions of Asia and Europe. That is why multiple nations, including India, China, US, and Russia, want to maintain their influence in this region. There is also a lot of untapped potential of Indian consumer goods over here. In fact, Indian tea and pharmaceutical industries have made their name in the Central Asian countries. We also see a lot of potential in IT and tourism with these nations, and that is why the government has been keen on forging positive relations with these nations. The next article that we have talks about the central government's several steps which have undermined the concept of fiscal federalism in India. The theme of the article is that the central government has taken multiple steps in the past year or so to undermine the fiscal federalism concept in India, to take out money from the hands of the state and to keep as much money in their hands as possible. The author also gives examples of multiple steps taken by the union government which go against the concept of fiscal federalism. The author here says that the government steps, such as asking the states to contribute more in the centrally sponsored schemes, giving unfair terms of reference to the 15th Finance Commission before they started working on their report, imposing demonetization without even consulting the states, bringing in GST, which is considered as unfair to the states, and also a delay in the transfer of GST compensation, all of which indicate that the central government is not working with a good faith. The government has to understand that we cannot have a situation where India is progressing without the states progressing. At the end of the day, India is made up of states. We can't have a situation where we say the central government is doing very well, but the state governments are not doing well. Only when the state governments perform well, only when the economy of the individual states improve, only and only then would the entire country's economy improve. And that is what the central government must understand. The situation has become even worse during the pandemic. The state governments were curtailed in the beginning from procuring testing kits for COVID. They were not even given any say in buying vaccines. And the center government decided the price for the vaccine without allowing the state governments to have any direct contact with the vaccine manufacturers. And when the center government was blamed for mishandling of the COVID, the union ministers repeatedly kept on saying that health is a state subject, which was an incorrect argument since the states were never given a chance to handle this crisis by themselves. Not just this, the article in fact is filled with examples of what the center government has done in the past few months for taking away the financial power from the hands of the state. For example, the Ministry of Cooperation has been formed at the center level, although cooperatives remain a state subject. That has been done at a time when the cooperatives are reeling under the pressure of lack of finances due to demonetization. Not just this, the center government also very silently has been increasing the collection of cess and surcharge since they don't have to divide it with the states. As you know, the tax that we pay to the center government, a part of it goes to the states. However, beyond the taxes, we also pay cess and we also pay surcharge. The interesting part about these two is that the money that we pay in the form of cess or surcharge is not to be divided between the center and the states and only goes into the pocket of the center government. For instance, agriculture remains a state subject, but the government has been collecting cess in the name of agriculture for the past few years now. Not just this, if you look at the money collected by the center government in the form of cess and surcharge, it has been increasing considerably. For example, in 2019-20, the money collected by the center government in total taxes, out of that 12.67% was from cess or surcharge, which was not to be divided with the state government. In 2020, the amount of money coming through cess and surcharge increased to 23.46%. Means about one fourth of the money coming from taxes was from cess and surcharge, from which the state governments were not given even a single penny. The situation is extremely bad in the petroleum sector also. As a report suggests, 68% of the total contribution of petroleum sector goes to the center government and only 32% is divided amongst the states. Just a few years back, it used to be 50-50. So as you can see, the share of revenue going to the state governments has been constantly shrinking over the past few years. We discussed this in one of the earlier articles also, that when the GST bill was introduced, the center government had promised that if there is a revenue shortfall, that is, if the state governments don't earn enough taxes from the GST, they will be compensated. But as we have seen, the center government has not compensated the states, calling it an act of God. The alternative given by the center government is that the state governments can borrow money from the market. But the problem with borrowing is that you have to return it back and it goes against your fiscal deficit targets. It is like a situation in which you had to give me 5,000 rupees back, but now you are saying, oh, I can't give you 5,000 back, so I will allow you to take a 5,000 rupee loan from the bank. These two cannot be the same. I have to pay back the loan, but that 5,000 rupees that you had to give me was my right. So the states obviously are angry with this. Not just this, the CAG recently in a report said that the union government wrongly did not pay a GST compensation of 47,000 crores to the states, and in place of that they deposited this money in the Consolidated Fund of India. Not just this, the center government recently announced that if any company makes a donation to Chief Minister's Disaster Relief Fund, it would not be counted as their CSR funding. Rather, they should donate to PM Cares Fund so that they can get CSR exemption. This is a direct signal to the companies to give money to center government and not to the state governments, which again goes against the concept of fiscal federalism. Now, the article towards the end also talks about certain solutions to this problem. The author here says that the states must argue with the center government for formation of a commission that clearly forms a robust fiscal distribution of power between the center and the state. We should also look into the concurrent list and see which subjects should be transferred towards the state. The states also must work together to create pressure on the center government as per the author. Recently, we saw that the Kerala finance minister invited the finance minister of other states also when the center government had passed on terms of reference to the Finance Commission, which were seen as very unfair by the South Indian states. This coming together of the states can be beneficial for them, and they should get together to demand the center government that the GST compensation for which is ending in 2022 should be extended to 2027. Means the state should demand that we should be compensated for our losses by the GST till 2027 and not only 2022. Not just this, cess should also be included in the divisible pool of taxes and not kept out of it. These are certain suggestions as per the author, which would only work if the states decide to come together. Now, it would be easier for you to understand how we reached here if you look at the history of tax distribution in India. So, let me tell you the history of how taxes have been divided between the center and the state governments since the time of our independence. So, when India became independent, the policy was that half of the income tax collected by the center government will be divided with the states. No other center government tax used to be given to the states. The first Finance Commission came up in 1951, and they said that apart from half of the income tax, 40% of excise duty collected by the center government on only three commodities should also be given to the states, because excise duty was the biggest tax collection item for the center government. After that, over the years, when more finance commissions started coming in, they also started adding to the revenue of the state governments. So, apart from income tax, many other taxes were now divided with the states. However, the first major change regarding distribution of taxes between center and the state came up in the year 2000 with the 80th constitutional amendment, which said that all the taxes collected by the union government will be shared. So, from sharing just income tax at the time of independence, in 2000 we reached a point where all taxes collected by the center government will be shared by the states. Now, you would assume that states will be happy, but they were not. Why? Because the center government was more intelligent. The center government now started using their own excuses in order to keep more money with themselves. How did they do that? Apart from putting taxes, they started putting cess and surcharges, which were not to be divided with the states. 14th Finance Commission, for example, said that the states should get 42% taxes. The 13th Finance Commission had only given 32% taxes, so it was a 10% increase. But in reality, this number of 42% was not real. In reality, the taxes that were given to the states were only 35%. Why? Because the remaining 7% was comprised of cess and surcharges. As cess and surcharges do not have to be shared with the states, the union government has now kept on increasing cess and surcharges to increase their revenue and not to share it with the states. Just see this. In 2011-12, the total tax revenue that the government of India earned, out of that 10.4% was in the form of cess. In 2021, that is after 10 years, it almost doubled to 20%. So the union government, instead of increasing taxes, has been increasing cess and surcharges so that they don't have to divide it with the state governments. Now, why is it that the center and states are fighting over this? The problem is that India does not have enough tax collection. India's tax to GDP ratio has been stagnant for many years. The 15th Finance Commission said the tax revenue of union and the states in India stood at about 17% of the GDP in 2017 and 18 and has remained constant since the early 1990s, which is a very, very bad sign. For any progressing country, the tax collection ratio to the GDP should increase. Only and only then the government would have enough money to spend on welfare exercises such as building of schools, healthcare sector, education, social schemes, etc. Let me give you an example of some of the most prosperous nations in the world. As you can see, some of the most prosperous nations in the world have a tax to GDP ratio of over 40%. Look at Denmark. They have a tax to GDP ratio of 46.3%. Look at Belgium, Sweden, Austria, Italy, Finland, Norway. These are the countries that always rank very high whenever it comes to the standard of living indices. Why? Because they have a lot of tax as compared to their GDP. For example, Denmark, because it has such a high tax to GDP ratio, has such a high tax collection, it offers free university education to all the EU citizens in the country. India lies extremely low at about 15 to 17% because we don't have enough taxes, and that is why the center and the states keep on fighting for dividing the same pie that we have. The next article that we have talks about the inequality in wealth and income that we have in India and across the world. This is not a very new topic. We have discussed it in the past also, but the authors here are trying to make a point that it is the government's policies that have resulted in this problem. As per the article, top 10% of the global population have over half of the world's income, while the bottom 50% people have only 8.5% of the income. The same uneven distribution is seen in the wealth of the entire world. This disparity in income and wealth is not the same throughout. It is the least in Europe, while it is the most in Africa. The authors also talk about a very generic misconception. We have a generic misconception that the average income level will tell us whether or not a country is unequal. Why? Because if you see in the US, which has a very high income level, it also has a very high inequality. The opposite is the case with Sweden. Sweden also has very high income level but very low levels of inequality, which shows that the income levels on an average will not tell you about the inequality. Inequality in income and inequality in wealth is because of government policies and the failure of the government to eradicate it. We cannot equate it to the increasing or decreasing income. Now, if we talk about India specifically, India has been known to be one of the most unequal countries in the entire world. Now, the reality is that a lot of things have changed in the past couple of decades. A lot of infrastructure has been built. Many lesser people are now dying of hunger. We have a successful public distribution system where food grains are given at a subsidized price. Many more villages have been electrified. Many more people are going to primary school even in the villages. Toilets have been constructed. Many more Indians now have a mobile phone and broadband internet connection. But the reality is that in terms of income and wealth inequality, the situation is becoming even worse. India's per capita gross GDP has increased 5 times from 2000 to 2019. But that does not mean that the income of all the people is increasing. Top 1% people in India earned 21% of the total income of the country in 2019. A good way to understand the income inequality in the country is by seeing the Gini coefficient, which measures the inequality in income distribution. The Gini coefficient in India in 2014 was 34.4 and has increased to 47.9 in 2018. As you know, the higher the number in the Gini coefficient, the more is the income inequality that the country has seen. As you can see from this graph, the income inequality is seen the least in Europe and the most in Latin America, with the top 10% earning close to 80% of the income in Latin America, while in Europe the number remains less than 60%. The next article that we have talks about what is happening in Hong Kong and the new laws that the Chinese government has introduced in Hong Kong and how it will change the entire region. Hong Kong recently held its first ever elections after China introduced new electoral reforms in the country. Ever since the reforms have been introduced, the citizens of Hong Kong have objected them, as a result of which less than 40% people turned out in the recent elections that were held. The recent changes by China include the changes in the rule of voting, vetting of candidates, as in who exactly can contest in the elections, and also increasing the number of seats in the Legislative Council of Hong Kong. China has time and again said that they do support democracy in Hong Kong, but they want democracy with Chinese characteristics. Means not complete liberty to the people, but liberty to an extent that the Chinese government decides. As you would know, the Hong Kong government is headed by a chief executive who is appointed at least on paper by some election committee of 1200 members. But in reality, all these 1200 members are forced to vote in a manner that the Chinese government wants. So, usually, whoever is a chief executive of Hong Kong is indirectly appointed by the Chinese government only and works not in favor of the Hong Kong citizens but in favor of the Chinese government. That is why in the past there have been a lot of protests against the chief executive. Hong Kong citizens have forced one chief executive to resign and forced another chief executive to not stand in the elections again in 2017. Hong Kong does not have its own constitution. They have something called the basic law, which is close to what a country's constitution is. As per the basic law, the chief executive does not have unlimited powers. The chief executive is controlled by the legislative council, kind of a small parliament. Now, till now, half of the members of legislative council were nominated by China and half of them were elected by the people of Hong Kong. But now China has increased the number of members in the council and has increased the number of members nominated by the Chinese government. Now, the Legislative Council of Hong Kong will always have a majority of people who are nominated by the Chinese government. Thus, they will never speak against the chief executive of Hong Kong. That is also one of the reasons why there are protests happening in Hong Kong. Thus, as I said, after the new rules, the Hong Kong chief executive will not face any threat of removal because most of the members of Legislative Council will be nominated by the Chinese government only. As discussed earlier, the legislature holds the key to check on the powers of the chief executive and can force him to step down under certain conditions. For example, if he cannot get enough votes on the bills or on the budget. But now that will not happen because the legislature is now being controlled by the Chinese government and not by the representatives of the Hong Kong citizens. The new rules, as we discussed, also includes vetting of the candidates. That is, before anyone can contest the election for the Legislative Council, a committee will check whether or not those people are patriotic enough. Now, the word patriotic can be defined as whether or not they support the Chinese government. If you don't support the Chinese government, you will not even be allowed to stand in the Hong Kong elections. Thus, as per the new rules, the opposition can't even block the bills that they don't like. Television shows, newspapers that have spoken up against the chief executive have been stopped from publishing their news by the Chinese government in the past few months. Now, what exactly is the history of Hong Kong and how is it such a matter of concern for China and the outside world? As you would know, Hong Kong was actually under the control of the British till 1997. After the Opium War ended, a treaty was signed between Britain and China, under which Hong Kong would come under the control of the British. This British control over Hong Kong remained till 1997. Thus, Hong Kong, although being a part of China historically, was nothing like China. The rule in Hong Kong was much more liberal. It was much more people friendly as compared to China. That is why after 1997, when China assumed control of Hong Kong, the problem started to rise because the citizens of Hong Kong were not used to that kind of a rule. As per the British Chinese treaty, after China takes over Hong Kong, China agreed that we will not touch the laws of Hong Kong for 50 years. It will remain unchanged. We will give high degree of autonomy to Hong Kong and we will not change their basic law, that is their mini constitution. Not just this, China also agreed that our socialist system and policies will not be practiced in Hong Kong for 50 years. However, China is now ignoring all of this. It was in 2003 that the first major pro democracy protest started in Hong Kong when the Chinese government tried to introduce a national security law under which no one was allowed to speak against the Chinese government. In 2014, 1 lakh residents came out on the streets under something called the Umbrella Revolution, where all of them held a yellow umbrella and protesting against China's control over Hong Kong. The two recent laws that have led to a lot of protest include the new national security laws of 2020 and the new electoral laws of 2021, which is discussed in this article. As I discussed, as per the new electoral system, the size of the legislature has been increased, the number of nominated members by the Chinese government has increased, the powers of chief executive have also been increased. In order to stand in elections now, you have to prove first that you are patriotic enough, and all these changes are not appreciated by the citizens of Hong Kong. Now, what has the world been doing about this? India specifically is concerned because Hong Kong is the fourth largest export market for India, and we think that through Hong Kong we can improve our relationships with China. However, that does not seem to be working out now. The Union government has also condemned the change that China is trying to bring in Hong Kong. The G7 has also termed this a step towards eliminating dissenting voices and opinions in Hong Kong. Major economies have condemned China for what it is doing in Hong Kong and also in Taiwan on an entirely different topic. The world also says that it is against the China UK treaty that was signed on Hong Kong. But the harsh reality is that China right now is so big and so important to most of the economies around the world, including the European economies, that there is no chance of them taking action against China or imposing sanctions because it will harm them more instead of harming China. These were the articles we wanted to discuss from the Hindu newspaper today. Now, a couple of practice questions. Number one, India has ignored the Central Asian economies for far too long. Do you agree with this assessment? In which sectors can India forge better relations with these nations? Second, the concept of federalism in India has evolved in different ways over the years. Discuss. Both these questions have to be answered within 250 words each. Thank you so much for watching the video.